My name is Oura Keisuke. I usually work at Japanese university named Ritsumeikan University. Now I'm in sabbatical year, visiting here, KU Leuven. Today I'd like to talk about the interfam control and role conflict and role ambiguity from a supplier perspective. First of all, I'd like to show the whole model in the next slide. And this slide, it is a conceptual model. I'd like to test hypotheses by using data from questionnaire survey in Japan. This study is divided in three parts. In the first part, I will examine the direct effect between interfirm control practices and performance. Second, I will examine whether role conflict and role ambiguity mediates the direct relationship between interfirm control practices and the relational performance. Third, I will investigate how interfirm control structure modulates the mediation effect of role conflict and ambiguity. Presentation go in this order, probably the same as the structure of a typical empirical paper. So let's go on to the next slide. The motivation for this research, I will explain what inspired me to set up this research question. My academic motivation is to overcome two gaps in the extinct research. The first is that prior studies have explicitly or implicitly treated the issues of interfirm governance structures from a controller perspective, or they discussed interfirm control issues without distinguishing between the controller party and the controlled party. This is why this study clearly distinguishes between controller and controlled sides, especially intentions in each side, and discussed mainly from supplier sides on the interfirm control problems. Second is to analyze at the individual level. I focus on the individuals of boundaries panel in a transaction. Several qualitative management accounting studies have analyzed the behavior of individuals in transactions, so this is some qualitative evidence on boundary spanners, although there is very little quantitative management accounting research on it. Okay, I will some more specific examples. This is an example of supply chain management practice in Japan. In the 1990s, the Japanese style of cost management became popular in management accounting literature. Target cost management is one of them. In Japan, buyers often set targets for suppliers, such as cost, quality, function, delivery date, and so on. And then buyers influence suppliers to achieve the goals which set by the buyer. And they monitor or review how suppliers achieve against the target. Next, take a look inside the company. Boundary spanners are also required to achieve accounting responsibilities. According to traditional responsibility accounting framework, he or she holds their own accountability on the process of performance management or budgetary control. So we can see the supplier side boundary spanners are exposed to the influences of both intra and interfirm control practices. In other words, they're often subject to overlap and interfirm management control structures. Therefore, the purpose of this study is to capture the effect of overlapping management control on supplier boundary spanners, which interact with intra and interfirm control practices. Interfirm control practices is a series of processes in which targets are preset and monitored or reviewed the achievement of their targets. The idea of this is based on the traditional management planning and control perspectives. And a closer look at the practices in Japan, a series of Robin Cooper's and Regina Slagmulder's paper provides the useful evidence. Buyers preset cost targets for suppliers. To do so, the buyers may also request suppliers to provide financial and non-financial information. They can use this information for benchmark with the other suppliers. If suppliers fail to meet targets, buyer will review and ask for detailed explanations of the cause of failure. In addition, buyers evaluate supplier outcomes or behaviors in such ways. Focusing on the information flow, the buyer soak up the various information from supplier to evaluate them. So, interfirm control assumes the power advantage. Interfirm control practices have the function to stimulate the suppliers to make more effort, and it is useful to achieve goal congruence or behavioral alignment with suppliers. Okay, and what I have told you so far should be enough about the hypothesis 1, the direct association between inter-firm control practices and performance. Hypothesis 1 is as follows. Relational performance is positively associated with inter-firm control practices. Inter-firm control practices will more clearly reveal conflict between role expectations coming to the sales managers from inside and outside the organization. More specifically, when sales managers are trying to respond to the interfirm control practices, they may need to be more active in boundary spanning activities toward the internal organization. For example, to meet buyers' requests on issues of price, quality, and delivery. Sales managers will need to make various explanations or coordinations to other departments within the firm, such as manufacturing or the design departments. So, role conflict is positively associated with the interfirm control practices, and relational performance is negatively associated with the role conflict. In addition, it is acceptable for sales managers to try to be customer-oriented in accordance with the interfirm control practice, because in recent years, both in academia and in practice, customer-oriented behavior has become widespread. The support customers and fulfill customers' needs. Interfirm control practices give the sales managers a clear goals or target level from buyer's perspective. So, relational performance is negatively associated with the role ambiguity, and the role ambiguity is positively associated with the interfirm control practices. Okay. Lastly, the dual responsibility within the firm increase both role conflict and ambiguity, which may cause psychological incongruity. So we expect the mediation effect of role conflict and role ambiguity are moderated by intra-firm control structure. To test these hypotheses, we conduct a questionnaire survey among sales managers of interfirm transactions. Sales managers seem directly interact with buyers. Samples were selected from manufacturing industry from listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. The questionnaire were distributed to 2,048 divisions. As a result, we get 384 valid respondents. And the structural extension modeling was employed to test the hypothesis, and the results shows like this figure 2. This figure 2 presents the results of estimation of structural equation modeling of direct and indirect effects in the model. First, the direct relationship between relational performance and interval control practices uh, did not disappear in the model 2, and as the coefficient is positive and significant. This point will be discussed later, but we can say that hypothesis 1 holds. And next, we find the positive and significant relationship between role conflict and interfam control practices as expected by hypothesis 2. In contrast, as expected in hypothesis 3, role ambiguity has a negative and significant relationship with interfam control practices. This suggests the control practices from bias make supplier boundary spanner more aware of their own role expectations, and it lowers the role ambiguity. As predicted by hypothesis 4, we find both low conflict and low ambiguity have a negative and significant association with relational performance. And we test the significance, the total effect and the mediating effect by bootstrapping 2000 times strapping from the same data set using the model 2. The total and mediating effect are summarized in this table, and hypothesis 5 is a test of the modulation effect of the intra-farm control structure. To test the modulation effect, we employ a multi-group structural equation modeling approach, in which the boundary spanner is divided into two groups. A significant and positive association between interfam control practices and performance is found both for PC group and NPC group. Next, we can confirm a negative and significant effect between role conflict and interfam control practices, and also a negative and significant relationship between role conflict and performance for PC group. Conversely, for the NPC group, the group that does not use profit indicators on a recurring basis, both indirect effect related role conflict is not statistically significant. This result indicates the partial mediation effect of role conflict can be confirmed only for PC group. In conclusion, focusing on the supply boundary spanners, this study examined the effect of interfam control practices on relational performance among buyer and supplier through the mediation effect of role conflict and low ambiguity held by supply boundary spanners. The survey results provide several empirical evidence about the role conflict and ambiguity of supply boundary spanners that is enhanced by the controlling practices by buyers. Our findings suggest that the low conflict and low ambiguity have a different mediation effect. Low conflict is more facilitated by interfam control practices and has a negative impact on the supplier's relational performance. On the other hand, role ambiguity is more mitigated by interfam control practices, which suppress any negative impact on the supplier's relational performance. So we have identified a partial mediation effect in this study. Furthermore, our findings reveal that the modulated mediation effect of role conflict by intra-farm control structure By implementing a stronger degree of interfirm control practices by bodies, for departments where profit information is used as a recurrence performance indicator, sales managers of boundary spanner are caught in a dual control structure. Hence, the cause of this type of role conflict can be attributed to what we call the duality of intra and interfirm control. Notwithstanding several limitations, this study explores the role of boundary spanners in the context of interfirm control practices and provides new insights into the relationship between interfirm control and performance. Okay, that's all my presentation. Thank you and